She learned to cry quietly in the shower, not because no one cared, but because every time she tried to explain, they made her feel like the sadness was her fault. I used to think silence was sacred, that maybe, if I stayed quiet long enough, someone would fill the space with understanding. But over time, I learned that silence could be sharp, not the soft kind that wraps around you like a blanket, but the kind that slices, that lingers too long after you've told the truth, and no one moves, no one speaks, as if your honesty has made the air too heavy to breathe. I remember sitting across from him in the dim kitchen light, 1:12 a.m., 2 mugs of untouched tea going cold between us. I had finally said something I'd been holding in for weeks. Not loud, not angry, just the bare truth about how I felt unseen. And there it was again. That pause, that stillness that used to feel full of meaning now felt hollow, like a vacant room with peeling wallpaper and no door out. He nodded, eventually, just once, as if acknowledgement could replace intimacy, as if silence was his answer and I was supposed to hear gratitude in it. That's the moment I began to understand something no one ever taught me. People don't always hurt you with what they say. Sometimes the deepest cuts are in what they don't. The way they skip over the parts of you that are shaking. The way they change the subject when your voice trembles. The way they never follow up. You tell them something you've never said out loud, and the next day they ask if you've watched the new Netflix series. Like your soul spilling was just background noise to their schedule. And I used to fill in those silences. With laughter, with apologies, with stories that weren't even mine. I used to soften my voice, round out the jagged edges of my pain so they wouldn't flinch. I'd say, never mind, before they could look uncomfortable. I'd delete the second text so I wouldn't look needy. I became an artist at erasing myself just enough to stay palatable. And I was so good at it, I forgot what I sounded like when I didn't filter for approval. There's this thing that happens when you're constantly met with emotional silence. You start questioning the noise inside you. Was it really that deep? Was I too sensitive? Did I imagine the ache? That's the most dangerous part. Not the pain itself, but the way it makes you doubt your own perception of reality. I became fluent in translating my needs into something smaller. I'd say, "It's okay," before I even knew if it was. I smiled in rooms that made my chest tighten. I told myself they were trying, even when their eyes never left their phones. Sometimes, when someone asked how I was, I'd respond like a script. "Good. You?" with an exclamation mark, because without it, I might sound cold. But the truth was, I wasn't good. I was hollow. I was tired of performing my own disappearance. I was exhausted by the weight of being the emotionally available one in conversations that never reached back. The hardest part? I didn't even realize I was disappearing. It happened in increments. The way a shoreline erodes with every wave, slowly, quietly, until one day you look up and there's nothing left but wet sand where something used to stand strong. That's how it felt. Like I used to be a woman with things to say, and somewhere along the way, I became the echo of other people's comfort. And yet, deep inside, there was still a voice, quieter than before, but persistent. She whispered things at night when the house was silent and my body finally exhaled. She said things like, "You don't have to be so quiet just to be loved." She reminded me of the version of me who used to speak without flinching, who used to ask real questions and wait for real answers, who wasn't afraid of depth, even if others were. But bringing her back meant facing a truth I didn't want to look at. that I had trained myself to find love in emotionally empty places, that I had learned to interpret indifference as mystery and withdrawal as strength. I had fallen in love with the idea of someone slowly learning how to hold me. But they never did, because I never required it. I just kept shrinking to fit their silence, hoping they'd notice the vanishing. It's strange how loud the silence becomes when you finally stop trying to cover it, when you stop performing and just sit with the emptiness. I started hearing things I'd drowned out for years. My own unmet needs, my own loneliness, my own anger. Yes, anger. That word I always swallowed because good women don't get mad, they get quieter. But I was angry, not just at them, but at myself. For every time I didn't speak up, for every time I made excuses for someone's emotional neglect, for every time I chose to be easy instead of real, I stopped asking people to meet me where I was. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. I realized I was never hard to love. I was just trying to be loved in places that only echoed back my own silence. Places that required me to dim the very light that made me feel alive. Places that applauded my strength but never held my softness. There's a kind of quiet that heals. But this wasn't that. This was the quiet of absence, of neglect, of emotionally vacant rooms with furniture too neat and hearts too locked. And I didn't want that kind of quiet anymore. I wanted noise, real, messy, vulnerable noise. I wanted to cry and not be told to calm down. I wanted to be felt, not fixed. I wanted someone to stay in the discomfort long enough to understand the shape of my sadness. But the truth is, no one can do that for you if you haven't done it for yourself first. And that's when something shifted. In the silence between their words, I finally heard mine again, unfiltered, unpolished, untamed. And in that small, trembling voice, I met a version of me I hadn't heard in years, the one who was no longer afraid to speak, even if the room went quiet again, the one who was ready to return to herself. And that's where I began to see it, the way I had been shining for others while leaving myself in the dark, and how that light, my own, would become the fire I'd need for the next part of the journey. I became so good at lighting up a room that no one ever asked if I had been sitting in the dark before I arrived. Compliments came like clockwork. You're so positive. You always know what to say. You make things feel lighter. And I believed them, or at least I wanted to, because being the light felt safer than being the storm. Because if I could be the one who fixed everything, then maybe no one would notice how badly I needed to be held together myself. I curated warmth like a habit, smiling at people who drained me, offering comfort to those who never stayed long enough to offer it back, stretching myself thin just to keep everyone else intact. I was the friend who answered texts at 2 a.m., the girlfriend who forgave before the apology, the daughter who never asked for too much. I was sunshine in every room, except my own. No one ever teaches you how dangerous it is to only be seen as light. You begin to feel guilty for your own shadows. You silence your sadness so you won't ruin someone else's mood. You don't say you're tired because they've had a long day. You don't cry too loud because someone might think you're breaking. And eventually, you start whispering even to yourself, convincing your own heart that its pain is too inconvenient to matter. I didn't know it then, but I had mistaken being lovable for being low maintenance. I kept making myself easier to hold by making myself smaller to carry. I laughed off the jokes that hurt. I forgave betrayals without asking why. I lowered the volume of my needs until I couldn't even hear them anymore. And I called that love. I called that strength. I wore it like a badge. She's so chill. She never complains. She's just happy. But I wasn't happy. I was performing happiness. I was drowning in brightness that no longer warmed me. And the worst part? I didn't even know how to stop. Because when you've spent years being light for everyone else, the idea of saying, "I'm not okay," feels like betrayal. Like if you collapse now, the whole world might notice and walk away because they only loved the version of you that made things easier. I remember standing in the mirror one night after everyone had gone home, mascara smudged under tired eyes, wine glass still full. I didn't recognize the girl looking back. She looked exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually, like she had been carrying too many things that didn't belong to her, like she had been smiling for too long, like she was afraid to be seen as anything but light. And that's when I realized I wasn't their light. I was their projection, their safe space, their healer, their cheerleader, their mirror, but never their person, never someone they chose to know deeply, because to know me deeply would mean seeing my shadows, my aches, my unmet needs, and most people don't stay for that part. Most people only want your glow, not the fire that keeps it alive. But I was tired of glowing for people who never once asked what it cost me. I was tired of pretending I didn't need what everyone else did: comfort, closeness, to be held without being asked to be less. I was tired of hiding the parts of me that were inconvenient to love. So I began turning down the light, not to disappear, but to rest, to relearn what it felt like to exist without performing, to ask myself, who am I when I am not who they need me to be? And the truth was soft and quiet and terrifying. I didn't know yet, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of performance and exhaustion, I could feel her, the real me, waiting patiently in the dark, holding a match. And she wasn't afraid of the shadows anymore. She knew the flame would return, but this time it would be only hers. There's a place inside me that no one's ever touched. Not because it's sacred, but because I've kept it hidden under all the versions of myself I thought the world would love more. It's quiet there, dim and unassuming, like an old attic filled with boxes I never unpacked. And when the texts go unanswered, when the calls stop coming, when the laughter fades and the house is still, that's where I go. Not out of choice, but out of instinct. The same way a wounded animal retreats into the woods, not to be found, but to survive. It's strange how loneliness can feel familiar, like a room you grew up in but never liked. I'd go there not because I wanted to be alone, but because it was the only place where I didn't have to pretend. No one expected me to be okay in that room. No one needed me to fix anything or smile through it. There, I could crumble without apology. I could feel the ache fully. No explanations, no edits. Just raw, messy sorrow curling in the corners of my chest, like smoke from a fire that never fully went out. Invisibility had become a kind of comfort. When no one saw me, no one could misread me. No one could label my silence as indifference or my boundaries as coldness. I didn't have to explain that my distance wasn't detachment. It was self-preservation. I didn't have to translate my sadness into softness just to be heard. I could sit with my truth, unfiltered, even if it scared me, especially because it scared me. And in that room, in that invisible place, I started to notice what I'd been too distracted to see, that the emptiness wasn't just from being alone, it was from being unknown. I had spent so much time trying to be easy to love that I had forgotten how to be real, how to say, "I'm not okay," and not cushion it, how to say, I need you to come closer," without fearing I'd sound needy. I had taught myself to be quiet about the parts of me that felt like too much. And so, slowly, those parts stopped speaking. Sometimes I'd scroll through my own memories like they were someone else's life. The girl who used to write poetry and cry when the sky turned pink. The girl who asked deep questions without worrying about sounding intense. The girl who felt things so deeply it scared people. I missed her, not because she was better, but because she was honest. She hadn't yet learned how to disappear gracefully. She hadn't yet been told that her emotional hunger made others uncomfortable. And maybe that was the real wound, not the loneliness itself, but the way I learned to soothe it by abandoning myself first, before anyone else could. If I left the room in my own mind, then maybe it wouldn't hurt as much when they didn't come knocking. If I silenced my needs before they could be denied, maybe I could survive not being chosen. It wasn't self-pity, it was self-defense. But even in that place, even in that hidden room, something in me still wanted to be found. Not saved, seen, not praised, understood, not celebrated, sat with. There's a difference. I didn't want applause. I wanted presence. I wanted someone to walk in, not with answers, but with eyes that didn't flinch when I finally let the pain show. And maybe that someone, I realized, had to be me. Because the truth is, no one can see you fully until you stop hiding from yourself, until you stop editing the ache and start listening to it, until you sit with the part of you you've avoided, the messy, tired, angry, tender version, and say, "You're allowed to be here too." That night, I didn't run from the silence. I sat in it like a witness. I lit a candle, opened a window, and let the air move through the room like forgiveness. I didn't say much. I just breathed and let the stillness speak back. And somewhere in the hush, I heard her, the part of me I buried. And she didn't sound weak. She sounded real. There are versions of me scattered across moments I never fully survived. Soft echoes left behind in rooms where I nodded yes while my body screamed no. In texts I rewrote 3 times to sound less attached. In smiles I gave to people who looked straight through them. I used to think abandonment only happened when someone walked away. I didn't realize I'd been doing it to myself in slow, polite ways. Every time I didn't speak, every time I stayed, every time I made myself easier to love by asking for less. I abandoned myself the moment I began treating my intuition like a liability. That quiet, knowing voice that rose in my chest when something felt wrong, I taught myself to ignore her, to override her with logic, with empathy, with excuses. I called it compassion, but it wasn't. It was fear. Fear of being too much, too sensitive, too honest. So I'd soften the truth until it didn't sting anymore, until it didn't protect me either. I gave people access to parts of me I hadn't even claimed for myself. I offered my energy like an open tab, believing if I loved hard enough, it would earn me safety. But all it earned me was depletion. I called it loyalty, but it wasn't. It was self-erasure with good manners. And the worst part was, I kept doing it again and again. Not because I didn't know better, but because I still believed love meant disappearing just enough to keep someone comfortable. There was the time I apologized for crying, as if grief needed permission. The time I dressed quieter because they said they liked subtle girls. The time I sat through a conversation that made me feel invisible, but still texted, "Thank you for tonight," as if presence alone was affection. I watered every dead thing just to prove I could bloom in barren soil. I was so scared of being left that I kept leaving myself first, so at least I'd be the one walking away. But self-abandonment is a clever kind of pain. It doesn't show up all at once. It comes in soft betrayals, the kind you almost don't notice until the emptiness starts to throb, until your body aches in rooms that look familiar, until your reflection starts to feel like a stranger, until you realize you can't even remember what you want anymore, only what will keep the peace. I kept calling it strength, this ability to hold everything without asking to be held. But it wasn't strength. It was silence. It was survival. It was the belief that love had to be earned through endurance, through emotional labor, through never being the one who needs too much. And one day, I looked around at the life I had built for others, the roles I played, the space I held, and realized I wasn't in any of it. Just the outline of me, smiling on cue. The real me. She was somewhere back at the first no I swallowed. The first moment I chose being agreeable over being authentic. The first time I felt something deeply and told myself I was overreacting. She wasn't gone, just waiting for me to remember her, to come back, to choose her, not when it was convenient, but when it was terrifying, when it meant people might not like her, when it meant setting boundaries and watching who walked away, when it meant finally, fully being whole instead of liked. So I began the slow work of return. I started naming my needs out loud. I said no without apologizing. I stopped shrinking in conversations just to make room for someone else's comfort. I stopped abandoning myself in small ways because I knew now it always led to bigger wounds. I told myself, gently, if you don't stand beside your own soul, no one else can either. And that was the beginning of something sacred. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift. A woman, no longer walking away from herself. There comes a moment when the mirror stops lying, when your reflection no longer flinches under soft lighting and filtered smiles, and instead looks you in the eye with something darker, something honest. I had spent years polishing the surface of me, the generous, resilient, emotionally intelligent woman, until I forgot there was anything underneath. But beneath the warmth and wisdom, there was a wildness I'd never dared to touch. She didn't want to be palatable. She didn't want to be liked. She wanted to be. And she wore my name like a memory I had tried to outrun. My shadow didn't arrive like a villain. She showed up like a forgotten song. Familiar, haunting, deeply human. She didn't scream. She whispered. She reminded me of the rage I tucked under grace, the bitterness buried beneath my "it's okay," the loneliness I masked with performance. I had always assumed healing meant moving toward the light, but the deeper I walked into myself, the more I realized the truth lives in the dark. I used to shame the parts of me that felt inconvenient, the jealousy I tried to ignore, the sadness that overstayed its welcome, the anger that made me feel out of control. I labeled them as flaws, as emotional clutter to be cleaned up before anyone got too close. But they weren't flaws. They were signals, wounds with voices. They were the unspoken stories that lived in my body, asking to be felt, not fixed. And I felt them, one by one. I let the anger rise like a tide instead of swallowing it. I let the grief spill over without translating it into wisdom. I let the envy exist without immediately turning it into shame. I didn't rush to reframe it. I didn't try to make it poetic. I just sat in the mess of it all. And finally gave myself permission to be human without the performance of healing. Because the truth is, the shadow isn't what makes us dangerous. It's what makes us real. It holds the parts of us that learn to scream in whispers. It carries the memories too jagged for daylight. And when we exile it, we exile ourselves. When we pretend we're only light, we become unreachable, untouchable, unwhole. So I met her, not with judgment, but with reverence. The part of me that slammed doors and hated being dismissed. The part of me that secretly resented giving more than I received. The part that didn't want to forgive just yet. She had been waiting for me to stop performing peace and finally feel the war I'd been waging inside. And in her eyes, I saw something ancient. Not cruelty, clarity. She didn't want to destroy me. She wanted to free me. To protect the girl who was always told to be kind, even when she was breaking. To guard the woman who learned to swallow her needs for the sake of being loved. To reclaim the power I had diluted into politeness. I wept for her. I thanked her. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to fix myself and started trying to listen, to integrate, to become more than just the good parts. Because only when I held her, the shadow that wore my name, did I begin to understand what wholeness really meant. Not perfection, not peace, but truth, with all its fire, its ache, its unstoppable beauty. There are men I loved who never really existed, only reflections of a longing I couldn't name. I didn't fall in love with them. I fell in love with the way they made silence feel familiar, the way their distance reminded me of someone I never stopped reaching for. It took me years to admit it. I wasn't choosing partners. I was reenacting childhood. Over and over, I tried to finish a sentence that began with my father's absence. He wasn't cruel. He was just quiet, absent in the way that makes you doubt your own presence. He'd sit in the same room, nod when necessary, but his eyes never searched for mine. His words never asked, "How are you, really?" So I became interesting. I became impressive. I became obedient and bright and endlessly low maintenance. Anything to pull his gaze toward me and hold it for just a moment longer. And that little girl grew into a woman who mistook emotional unavailability for mystery, who craved men she had to earn, who felt most alive in the pursuit, because being chosen without effort felt foreign, suspicious, almost untrustworthy. I called it chemistry, but it wasn't. It was reenactment, trauma playing dress-up as romance. I was still that girl waiting for her father to turn his head, to see her fully, to say, "I notice you. I care." So I fell for men who listened with half-closed eyes, men who loved the idea of me, but couldn't hold the weight of my reality, men who praised my strength but shrank from my sorrow. And each time they pulled away, I clung harder, not because they were right for me, but because I thought if I could just make this one stay, I could rewrite the story. I could finally become the version of myself who was worth remaining for. But no one told me. Projection feels like connection, until it doesn't. Until the high wears off and you're left staring at someone who was never capable of loving you the way you needed. Not because you were unworthy, but because they were never meant to be your redemption. I didn't want a partner. I wanted resolution. I wanted my pain to be disproven by someone else's affection. But healing never happens in repetition. It happens in rupture. The moment I stopped asking men to give me the closure my father never did, everything changed. I grieved deeply, not just the men, but the little girl who worked so hard to be chosen, the one who blamed herself every time someone turned away, the one who learned that love was something to chase, to deserve, to endure. I wept for her, not because she was broken, but because she tried so hard to fix what wasn't hers to heal. And slowly I began to unhook my worth from the eyes of the distant. I began to ask, "Do I feel safe with you?" Instead of, "Can I make you stay?" I began to recognize that love doesn't ask for sacrifice as proof. It doesn't mirror your wounds. It mends them gently without drama or delay. For the first time, I stopped waiting at the door for someone who might come back, and I turned inward, toward the girl, the woman, the self who had always been waiting, not to be rescued but to be remembered. Grief is not always loud. Sometimes it moves like soft breath beneath your ribs, invisible to everyone but you. I didn't grieve in the ways people expected. There were no dramatic breakdowns in public, no tear-stained confessions. I grieved like women are taught to, quietly, gracefully, in the gaps between tasks. I washed dishes with a lump in my throat. I answered emails while swallowing heartbreak. I smiled in group photos with a grief lodged so deeply in my body it became part of my posture. But I wasn't just mourning the men who left. I was mourning the years I spent betraying myself to make them stay. I grieved the silence I called strength, the boundaries I never spoke aloud, the softness I diluted for people who feared its depth. I wept for the birthdays I made magical for others while mine passed like afterthoughts, for the times I twisted my truth into something they could swallow, for the laughter I gave away like currency, hoping it would buy me closeness. No one warned me that healing would feel like loss, that becoming whole would require burying so many versions of myself, the performer, the pleaser, the forgiver, the girl who didn't ask for much. I had to grieve her too, the one who knew how to stay quiet in chaos, the one who offered understanding before it was ever earned, the one who clung to love that hurt because the ache still felt better than emptiness. And it was in that morning, the slow, private kind, that I discovered something sacred. That grief, when honored, becomes a form of rebirth, not the glamorous kind, not the triumphant glow-up the world celebrates, but the soft reformation of a woman who no longer lies to herself, a woman who no longer calls pain passion, who no longer stays just to be chosen, who no longer explains herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. There were days I couldn't get out of bed, days where the weight of all I had given away without receiving made my chest ache like a storm. But even on those days, I never once wished to go back, because I knew, for the first time, I was grieving the right thing. I wasn't mourning the loss of someone else. I was mourning the loss of the woman I had to become to survive what I didn't deserve. And that kind of grief? It's holy, because it clears space, because it says, I'm done dressing wounds I didn't cause, because it whispers, there is more to you than what they couldn't love. And in that stillness, with mascara on my pillowcase and no one to impress, I felt it, not peace, not yet, but permission, to stop bleeding quietly, to stop being the strong one, to let the grief have a name, a shape, a voice, and for once in my life, I let it sing. There is a moment, quiet and unannounced, when the grief starts to turn. When the ache that once hollowed you out begins to pulse with something different. Not rage, not even hope, just heat. A slow, unfamiliar burn that rises in your chest when you realize, I'm not broken anymore. I'm waking up. It wasn't loud. No one clapped. There was no cinematic music swelling in the background. It happened on an ordinary morning. Hair messy, coffee bitter, sky overcast. When I said no to something I would have once bent over backwards to accommodate. And I didn't explain it. I didn't soften it. I just said it. Clear, steady, final. And in that small refusal, something ancient stirred in me. The part of me that remembered who I was before the world told me I had to be pleasing to be loved. That was the beginning of fire. Not the kind that scorches earth in anger, but the kind that warms the bones, the kind that returns to a woman when she no longer asks permission to exist. I started to reclaim space. I took up room in conversations without shrinking. I said what I meant, not what would be easiest to digest. I dressed for my own gaze. I laughed louder. I rested unapologetically. I stopped making myself a translation of who I truly was. The woman I used to be, the one who apologized before speaking, who rehearsed texts, who worried she was too intense. She was still there, but I no longer bowed to her fears. I lit a match where she whispered caution. The fire didn't make me cruel, it made me honest. I stopped calling it kindness when I let people trample my needs. I stopped confusing silence with maturity. I stopped holding back my truth to protect people from the discomfort of growth. If my clarity felt like confrontation to someone, I let it. Because I had spent too long dimming down just to be palatable. I was done handing out smaller versions of myself to make others feel bigger. And yes, it cost me. People left. Some didn't understand. They missed the soft version of me who wrapped her pain in empathy, who folded every boundary into a whisper. But I didn't miss her, because I had finally found the part of me that didn't flinch. The part of me that didn't need to be loved by everyone, just by the one woman who had spent years forgetting her own worth, me. There's a holiness in a woman reclaiming her fire, not to burn bridges, but to light her own way forward. A woman who no longer asks, "Am I too much?" but instead declares, "This is who I am, whether you can hold it or not." And in that blaze, I wasn't consumed. I was clarified. Because fire doesn't just destroy, it reveals, it purifies, it makes room. And in the ashes of everything I thought I had to be, I finally met the woman I was always becoming. For so long, I wore strength like armor, sharp edges, tight smiles, perfectly timed boundaries, because softness had once made me bleed. I believed that to survive, I had to be steel, that tears were dangerous, that tenderness invited harm. So I sharpened every part of me that once ached too openly and called it healing. But beneath the fire I had reclaimed, there was still a girl who whispered through the smoke, "Do I still get to be gentle?" The answer came slowly, like rain after drought. I started to notice the places where my defenses were no longer needed, where love didn't require me to be vigilant, where being open didn't mean being unprotected. There was a moment, small and unremarkable, when I cried in front of someone and didn't apologize. I didn't clean it up. I didn't hide behind words like "just tired" or "I'm fine." I just let the softness have its space, and nothing shattered. No one left, and something deep inside me exhaled. That's when I realized softness was never weakness. It was the part of me I had buried under everyone else's inability to hold it. It was my birthright, not something to earn, not something to defend. We're taught to believe strength is about how much we can carry, how little we ask for, how silent we can stay while breaking. But strength, I've learned, is the courage to stay soft in a world that taught you not to be, to speak gently when your instinct is to run, to love again when your past says, "Protect yourself," to be open, even with a scarred heart. I used to flinch at my own tenderness. I used to rewrite texts 3 times to sound less vulnerable. I used to fight the lump in my throat like it was betrayal. But now I welcome her. I let her rise in me like tide water. I let her sit at my table and remind me, strength is not the absence of emotion. It is the permission for emotion to live freely, to be honored, not hidden. And the more I softened, the more clearly I could hear myself. the quiet voice beneath the performance, beneath the fire, beneath the fear, the one that said, "You don't have to keep proving your worth by how little you need." She was never gone, just waiting for me to stop equating pain with proof. So I let softness return, not as weakness, but as wisdom. The kind that doesn't need to yell, the kind that doesn't need to beg, the kind that sits still and says, "I am here, and I am worthy, even in this." And in that stillness, I didn't lose power. I found peace. Because the most powerful thing I had ever done was to hold my own heart gently and let it stay open. It didn't arrive like a thunderstorm or a grand confession. It didn't knock the wind out of me or sweep me off my feet. When love finally came home, it was quiet, like a familiar scent in an old room, like a melody you forgot you knew all the words to. It didn't feel like fire. It felt like warmth. It didn't ask me to change. It met me where I already was, soft, scarred, and whole. Because this time, love wasn't someone else's eyes lighten up when I performed the right version of me. It wasn't a text I waited on, a promise I clung to, a maybe that kept me up at night. This love was different, not because of who gave it, but because of who received it. Me. I had spent years searching for someone to return to me the love I had so freely given away, hoping it would come back multiplied, gentler, safer. But what I never realized was that my search had been pointing inward the entire time. Every heartbreak, every silence, every moment of self-erasure had led me to this threshold, where I no longer chased, begged, or bargained, but stood still, palms open, heart steady, saying, "Welcome home to myself." I didn't need grand gestures anymore. I needed alignment, peace, a love that didn't start in someone else's mouth, but in the quiet of my own chest, the kind that says, "I will not abandon you again." And when someone did arrive, not to complete me, but to witness me, I could meet them without fear. I didn't need to impress or outperform or protect myself through perfection. I could let them see the girl who once cried quietly in showers, the woman who burned her way out of silence, the soul who sat with her shadow and chose to stay. Because by then, I already knew. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen myself. And love, real love, doesn't feel like being rescued. It feels like being met, fully, calmly, without performance or panic. That's how I knew it was home, not because it filled a hole in me, but because there was no longer one to fill. I had returned to myself. I had stood in every fire, every silence, every mirror, and I was still here, alive, software worthy. And this time, I didn't whisper it like a question. I carried it like a truth.